Hello and welcome to the Performance Car Podcast. My name is Scott Newman, Associate Editor of Motor Magazine.
My name's Dylan Campbell, I'm the editor at Motor Magazine.
And in the back recording this, as ever, we've got Josh Robinson. Thanks, Josh. Today we are in the Volvo S60 Polestar, the new one, which has traded a 3-litre turbocharged 6 for a 2-litre twin-charged 4-cylinder. So that means supercharger and turbocharger, like a Lancia Delta S4 or an old-school VW Polo GDI. The figures are roughly similar to what it had before. It's got 270 kilowatts and 470 newton meters, 0 to 100 in 4.7 seconds, and it's had a bit of a price cut too, which is $89,990 for this sedan which we're in, and you can also get it as a V60 Polestar wagon for $92,990, which we think is a bit cooler. It's got new rims and there's a couple of styling tweaks, but the main point of order is under the bonnet, which brings us to our topic for today, which is downsizing performance engines. It's rife at the moment among the performance industry. So Dylan, why is everybody putting smaller engines in their performance cars?
That's right, Scotty. Yes, downsizing is upon us, and manufacturers are having to downsize for emissions regulations. Basically, they're all under a lot of pressure to bring down their fleet average fuel consumption.
So what does that mean?
That means you've got, if you're a manufacturer, you have, say, 6 cars in your range. The average fuel use for those 6 cars has to be under a certain point. And if you have cars that use a lot of fuel kind of thing, then it's going to be difficult for you to bring those emissions down. That's why we saw Aston Martin introduce the bizarre Signet model, just to bring its emissions average down as like an emergency measure, I suppose, to protect its big thirsty V12s.
Yep, and it works quite well for big companies like VW Group because it works on a group basis. So therefore, for every Bugatti Chiron they sell, they can sell lots and lots and lots of little hybrid Golfs that they make now. So the big problem is that those regulations continually change. A couple of years ago it wasn't so hard, now it's getting harder. It's always a shifting target, and I think maybe in 2020, I'd have to check, but the targets get really tough, as in so tough that only a few cars at all, fall under the threshold, let alone fleet averages. So this is leading performance car makers to get the same power out of it. They need to make a smaller turbocharged, usually, engine. So Dylan, have you got some examples of manufacturers and models that have taken this approach?
So the car we're sitting in at the moment is a prime example. It's it had a 3-litre turbo 6 before, now it's got a 2-litre turbo 4. Cars like the C63 Mercedes AMG that used to have a 6.2-litre V8, now it's got a 4-litre V8. Massive cut. So we're seeing it across the board, and even some cars like the new Porsche Boxster and Porsche Cayman 718 that previously had a 6-cylinder naturally aspirated engine, now it's got downsized 4-cylinder turbocharged engines. So it's not just capacity that we're seeing come down, but it's also cylinder count.
That's right, and as you mentioned, all those cars you mentioned, and pretty much every car that this is happening to, 911, etc., RS4, RS5, now are replacing, as the V8 Commodore goes past us, now replacing big capacity naturally aspirated V8s, like the example we just heard, with smaller turbocharged engines. And Dylan, you made the point that perhaps we're in a golden age of turbocharging now. Maybe it's not such a bad thing to be losing these cars, because maybe are we getting the best of both worlds, power and economy?
Yeah, I was thinking about this the other day. We often look back to the 80s with cars like the F40 and Quattro, and a lot of Japanese cars as well. We think about how awesome they were, that they were turbocharged, very characterful turbocharged engines that came on boost really aggressively and hissed and had heaps of power. But we're forgetting that we're going through another era of turbocharging right now. We're seeing lots of innovation in turbocharging, like turbos in the Hot V, sort of different approaches to bigger, smaller turbos, multiple turbocharging. This is an era of turbocharging that we're in right now. It is probably the golden era.
Yeah, absolutely. To just expand on that Hot V topic, there's, especially among the German manufacturers, the V8s, they put the turbos now, they basically reversed the manifold, so the turbos are inside the V of the engine, which creates massive heat problems, but the advantage is it shortens the inlet tracks, so the air doesn't have to move as fast, move as far, so therefore you get much better throttle response. So it's a good point in that we are in a golden age of turbocharging like the 80s, but it's a very different era because they're trying to make the cars as responsive and as sort of natural feeling as possible, rather than having that huge lag, which made old school turbo cars quite exciting. These cars aren't like that. They're not chasing that big turbo rush. They're using turbocharging for a very different goal.
Yeah, it's interesting that manufacturers and engineers are trying to make turbocharged engines behave as much like naturally aspirated engines as possible. And sometimes you get into one of these new turbocharged cars and you just think to yourself, "Oh, wouldn't it be fun if it came on boost aggressively at 3,500 RPM like an old school turbo engine?" And instead of trying to engineer out the characteristics of a classic turbocharged performance engine, owning it and making it part of the car's personality.
Well, it's interesting. Porsche do that now in that when I spoke to the head of the Boxer engine development for the 911, and I spoke that what's the point of a 911 turbo if all the 911s are turbo, as they are now. All the Carreras have a 3-litre twin turbocharged 6, and he said that delivery is the key point for the Porsche 911 turbo. They still want that wait, bang, that massive turbo hit, whereas they're trying every trick they know in the normal Carrera models to smooth out the power curve. And they play with ignition timing, they play with fuel timing and all sorts of things, and obviously boost levels to make sure you still get that crescendo of power. And some manufacturers do it better than others. Trying to think, AMG do it pretty well. The new engine, the new 4-litre twin turbo V8 is quite smooth, whereas some cars still feel a bit breathless. I'm thinking of the Mini JCW we had recently. That is a car that feels really breathless at the top end. So not everyone's got it right. Turbocharging still has a way to go, though, I think. You're saying we're in the golden age now, but what's exciting is using electricity with turbocharging. We did the last podcast on an Audi SQ7, which is one of the first cars to use one of those e-compressors to basically fill in the gaps of the turbocharged power curve. Mclaren P1 does the same thing. It uses batteries to torque fill the gaps, and the end goal of this is, I suppose, to have electric motors on the turbos themselves. So rather than using the exhaust gas, you use an electric motor. So you could have the end point of this is, it could be really good in that you'll have a smaller engine that does act exactly like a bigger engine, which makes me quite optimistic. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, with the way technology is heading, the direction it's heading in, does suggest that we're starting to reach the limitations of turbocharging and downsizing in terms of trying to meet these tightening emissions regulations.
In a conventional sense,
yeah. It does excite me. I mean, the thought of electrification in a naturally aspirated engine, using electrification to help the naturally aspirated engine achieve its economy goals, that excites me, and it might help to preserve supercars like the Aventador and whatnot.
Yeah, that's a whole other thing as well, isn't it? Not just using the batteries to fill in the turbocharged gaps, but that excites me a lot as well, because you do truly get the best of both worlds, apart from the weight problem, because especially if city centres go towards this, you have to have a zero emissions car to drive in London or Paris or New York or whatever it may be. Well, you can get that. You can get the 50 Ks, 80 Ks of electric only range. I mean, you've driven a Porsche 918, you lucky thing. So that's a car that can operate in electric only mode and use zero fuel and make zero noise, but you still get that amazing spine tingling Atmo V8 or V10 feeling when you want it. I mean, for me, the BMW M3 went to a turbo 6, and I always think it would have been amazing to have that old V8, but with batteries as well, because you get more torque, you'd get more power, but still that emissions reduction. But let's talk about some of the good examples of downsizing. Who do you think has got this new turbocharged era right?
Yeah, some manufacturers, their products have benefited from turbocharging, and I reckon an example is the new C63. It's a muscle car, and the turbocharging adds a lot of low-down torque. Not to say the previous engine lacked torque.
No.
But if you drove both engines...
It's got too much torque now.
That's right. If you drove them back to back, it would feel torqueless kind of thing, which is crazy, because once upon a time, V8s were the torquey engines. But now, unless they have two turbochargers hanging off the side of them, they feel like they lack low down. So for me, the C63, though the rear axle alone struggles to get the power to the ground, because of all this new torque.
That's a good point. Like the Lexus GSF, which has a big thumping V8 with a lot of power.
Yeah.
You drive it now and you go, wow, this feels a bit weedy because it hasn't got that massive surge of power that is in pretty much every performance car these days.
That's right. And in the late 90s and the early 2000s, if you wanted torque, you bought a naturally aspirated V8. But now these cars feel like they lack torque, like you were saying.
Absolutely. The other car I've just thought of that I think is a poster child for turbocharging is one of our favourites, the Ferrari 488.
Yeah,
which has used turbocharging to devastating effect.
Super interesting application of turbocharging. I mean, obviously the previous car, naturally aspiration was such a big part of the previous car's personality and effectiveness and why we loved it so much. So it's become a very different car with turbocharging.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we move on to a clever thing with the Ferrari, what I want to touch on, do we like these cars because they've done the turbocharging well, or do we like them just because those two examples, for instance, are cars that sound good? They've still managed to capture the sound, because that's one of the big downsides of this push is that turbos muffle sound. It's part of their deal. It's physics. But the AMG V8 still sounds amazing. I still think the Ferrari sounds pretty damn good as well. But it is one of the biggest hits to performance cars, like a BMW M4 doesn't necessarily sound that amazing, although they're working on it, does have a bit more character. So what do you think about that? Do we like the performance, or like does the performance make up for the lack of sound, do you think?
Yeah, it's like what are we mourning? What have we lost in this sort of transition to turbocharged engines? And for me, it is sound a lot of the time.
Yeah.
It's a lot of the time it's also response. Some turbo engines can be quite laggy. They don't sort of rev as keenly as a good naturally aspirated engine, and I really feel sad for the loss of the top end of the tacho on a really like high performance naturally aspirated engine. And the 488 is a good example of that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you can shift now at 6,500 instead of 8,500. It's just what you do. You're not lacking any speed. You're not lacking any. And you just where you kind of need to shift.
You feel like you're short shifting compared to the 458.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to surf along in cars now, just using 4,000 RPM and just flying along, which is its own enjoyment. But there is a thrill to using every last RPM. Thank God for R8 V10s and GT3s.
Absolutely. A lot of these turbocharged engines, you don't need to extend them to their rev limiter. The engine performance is spread broadly across the rev range. Whereas obviously in the Atmo engine, the engine performance is right up with the engine spinning as fast as it can, moving as much gas through the engine as it can. And that was so exciting to extend it right out to the limit of the cars. It feels really alive.
What's interesting, a couple of points you made, is that the C63 and a lot of these cars now really struggle to contain the level of torque. But Ferrari have sort of cleverly used that, and that goes back to what we were talking about with the different technologies they're using now with the staggered torque maps, which sounds kind of weird, but it actually works really, really well in maximising that turbo torque with So basically, Ferrari and a couple of other manufacturers, they've limit the power in each gear so that each successive gear gives you more torque. There's lots of clever algorithms there that, judge the available traction and everything like that. But do you agree that that's a really good solution in managing this extra power, but making the car more drivable?
Yeah, it does. You have a huge amount of torque and you can use it kind of thing. You can't use it in first gear, but you can use it in 6th or 7th gear. And it's sort of like, it helps to give turbocharged engines their own personality a little tiny bit. Like the 488's acceleration is absolutely mind-shattering. It just does not stop accelerating.
Well, that staggered torque delivery gives you the weird feeling of the car it feels to accelerate the same speed in every gear, which you never really think about as you drive a sort of regular car. You become programmed to, as you select a new gear, this feeling of acceleration slackens off a bit, which is fine. So it's kind of an unnatural feeling when you pull gears and the car doesn't feel to slow down anymore, which is not because it's getting a big hit of extra power, which I guess is a good example of how new age turbocharging can be exciting and deliver a thrill in its own way.
Absolutely, yeah. It can deliver a thrill that's something different to natural aspiration, and manufacturers probably need to own that a little bit more.
Absolutely. So there's a dark side to this downsizing, though, which we're going to call the great downsizing lie, in that as we said at the top, that the reason for this downsizing is that manufacturers have to hit these fuel economy targets, emissions targets, but which they do. On paper, they do, because basically under the official fuel economy tests, it's quite long and involved. Well, it's actually not a very long test, but it's quite involved. But basically the car spends a lot of time cruising around on a rolling road at very, very low RPM, being accelerated very, very slowly, which works really well for these turbocharged cars because they've got a lot of torque, long gear ratios, and they can probably do the whole test with not exceeding 1300 or 1400 RPM. The trouble is though, to make a certain amount of power, and these engines are all very, very powerful, you need to burn a certain amount of fuel. So how often have we been on tests when you get the fuel figures on these cars and they are, to put it mildly, horrendous. You know, a C63, for instance, will easily chew through, an A45 AMG, for instance, will chew through more than 20 litres per 100k if you're giving it a strop. So that's where, I guess, as an enthusiast, we struggle to accept this future a little bit because it's all a bit for nothing.
It's a little bit farcical, really. Like from a real world perspective. Like I'm sure we've been on tests where we've had naturally aspirated cars deliver better fuel economy when you're using the performance.
Absolutely.
And that is just, it's upsetting because we're seeing a lot of these heroic naturally aspirated engines biting the dust, getting replaced with downsized turbo engines. A lot of the times the replacement is not as good, or at least characterful as the previous engine, and not for the purpose that it was designed for.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't really blame the car makers, I suppose. Their hands are a little bit tied. But for an example, we did a test a couple of years ago. We used the Porsche Boxster GTS, which still had the 3.4 litre Atmos 6, amazing engine. We had a BMW M4 convertible, which is part of this new age downsizing trend, and a Jaguar F-Type V6 supercharged, which is always going to be a thirsty engine just by its inherent design. But by far the most economical car over that test of performance testing, road testing, just general driving around, was the Porsche Boxster GTS. It was relatively frugal, and that was supposedly the big, thirsty, polluting, dirty Atmo engine. So it's a real problem that, and we've seen this a bit with the VW Dieselgate scandal, and that there has been a bit of a push for more real-world testing, but sadly it's almost become a bit too little too late for some of our favourite engines. Yeah,
and we were talking earlier about the sort of range average, getting the average fuel economy of your range down, and there's sort of like different solutions you can come up with to try and achieve that. And obviously we've seen downcharging and forced induction as a solution to that. But going forward, there are other things that could help to solve that engineering challenge.
Absolutely, and I think the hope for us enthusiasts is that there are a couple of manufacturers that remain committed to another way. I spoke with Aston Martin CEO Andy Palmer recently about this very topic. I said, how are you going to keep these big thirsty V12s with these? And he said there's two ways to do it. You can downsize your engines, which most people are doing, and he wasn't a huge fan of, or to achieve it another way, you have to get a big offset. And what that means is that you can keep your big engines, but you've got to go battery electric for your other cars. So for Aston Martin, for instance, are going their new Rapide, their new SUV, their new sedans will be electric only, so therefore zero emissions, which means that on an average basis they can keep a V12 in the DB11, they can keep a V12 in the Vanquish, they can keep AMG V8s in there, and we're seeing Porsche do that a little bit as well, like this new Mission E, as you said, can extend the life, hopefully, of the naturally aspirated GT cars, if not, the Carrera models that seems their time has passed. So hopefully this move to electrification, rather than taking the joy out of enthusiast driving, can actually extend the life of some of the, the noisy, aggro engines that we love. Because the engineers love them as well. You speak to the engineers, they're big fans of these things.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's been this resistance to electrification because it is like, you're basically making your car into a kitchen appliance. But then if you think about it from the range economy kind of point of view, it is helping to preserve these awesome naturally aspirated engines.
Absolutely. Well, that probably wraps us up for today. So let us know, as ever, in the comments, what do you think about this downsizing trend? Do you like this? Do you like these new wave of turbo cars? Do you mourn the fact that these great naturally aspirated engines are dying? Well, as ever, let us know. YouTube, Facebook, anywhere you like. So we'll see you next time for another episode of the Performance Car Podcast.
Bye.